Welcome back to the scenario planning class. The first session, we're going to go through and give a quick recap about what we did when we met face-to-face. Today's session, we'll go through and build upon that. So if we reflect briefly on the last session, we looked at the introduction to scenario planning. Why is it growing in importance? It's growing in importance partly because the world is increasingly volatile. It's being used by a range of businesses from different sectors. Scenario planning itself is a three-step process, and we'll be talking about those 3 steps in a few moments' time. The critical thing about scenario planning is working on your mindset. So this is about a mindset development exercise that many leaders are doing around the world at the moment. And in the first session when we met face-to-face, we went through and did a wargaming scenario situation. So that was back in early March. Just to recap in terms of some of the pictures that I showed you in that class, Harvard Business Review a couple of years ago was showing about what do the great chief executives do differently, and scenario planning is one of the things they do to outstrip their competitors. One of the examples of that is Elon Musk. One of the key things about scenario planning is the inability for many people to go through and plan ahead in an accurate manner. We suffer from things like optimism bias. Optimism bias means that we always go through and think about things in the future in an upward projection, when exactly the opposite happens. So this is a starting point for scenario planning. On top of that, when we're talking about volatility, I showed you a slide in the first class where we talk about the tenure of chief executives. In 1972, they were in their job for about 12 years. Now it's down to about 6 years. So we're living in these volatile times. So a reminder, what exactly is scenario planning? It's about 3 steps. The first step is to go through and actually understand your business. Step number 2 is to think about where do you get information, data, in terms of the trends of the future. And today's session is talking about macro trends. And the third step is the so what. What does this really mean to your industry and your business? So they're the 3 steps, and that's what this course tries to go through and get you to think about. So this is really about mindset development, opening up executives' minds, leaders' minds, your minds, to inconceivable events that do take place. Look at what's happening at the moment with the virus. You speak to people 3 months ago, 2 months ago, this type of thing was inconceivable, and yet you've got major dramatic ramifications to the stock market and businesses as a result of that. Number 2, this is really about being proactive, to try and be ahead of your competitors, thinking through about some of these seemingly inconceivable events, and to go through and work out how can you plan better to go through for that particular situation. Number 3, this is really about making judgments that are looking into the future. It's not just about short-term proactive plans, it's about the world in the next 3, 5, 10 years' time. And the people who do this really well, they are looking at things which look inconceivable at the moment, but they actually happen. And when they happen, that makes them smarter, better performers compared to their competitors. Number 4, the goal of scenario planning is about not to go through and get an accurate representation of the future. It's about the possible viable options, things that could occur in the future, because the world will not go along in one linear path. It's going to have viable different options. And the last thing is that we have to go through and encourage a mindset which is really creative, something that realizes the world changes in wild, wacky, unexpected ways. One thing is for sure, it will not carry on a boring, predictable path. If you look back to the last 3 or 4 years, there's been this rocky road. These are called wild card events that keep on happening time and time again. And the best companies are the ones that are trying to go through and think about those potential events, and then they plan for it as well. So what are the benefits of scenario planning? Number 1, it's about mindset development. It really expands your comfort zone. It gets you to go through and think things in totally different ways, okay? To do that, you have to go through and get access to data, and that is a really rich, deep insight that it provides leaders that go through the scenario planning process. Number two, it helps people go through and engage with things which are about powerful drivers of the future. These kind of interaction with trends gets you to think about the world in slightly different ways. Many people are thinking about what happened in the past. What's happening today, very rarely do they think about 12, 15, 18 months or 5 years in the future. Number three, it gets you to go through and challenge status quo. It gets you to challenge groupthink. Everybody thinks in very, very similar tramlines. Scenario planners are good at being in the 1, 2, 5, 10% that think about things in different ways, okay? And an example of governments that say that we need to go through and reach out of our comfort zones. So the Singapore government in 2017, they said that they needed to have more people that are brave enough, courageous enough to say no to the way that established practices happen in certain parts of Singaporean government and society. And finally, it helps you to go through and really understand how businesses get together. How do they go through and interact, weave together? So these are 4 of the ways that scenario planning is seen to be beneficial. So there are disadvantages to scenario planning as well. Number 1 is that there is a very fine line between looking at things which are potential creative ideas of the future, and number 2, wild, crazy guesses. When I first started teaching scenario planning about 7 years ago, there were students that were trying to go through and include things like an alien invasion and how that would change the business situation scenario. You have to go through and use plausible, viable data to go through and do this exercise. So there's a fine line between these 2 things. Number 2, it's too much of a comfort blanket. Some organizations that go through scenario planning feel that they are now insured against any potential shock in the future. This type of exercise needs to be done continuously, otherwise you're always going to be surprised by unusual events that occur. For some societies, particularly across Asia, this is regarded as an abdication of leadership. If a leader comes to their employees and says, look, we just don't know what's going to happen in the future, for some organizations, for some cultures, this is regarded as a sign of weakness. They have to look like they know what's happening in the future. To do this really well, it is incredibly time consuming. This can go through and take months and years to go through and do really well. Shell, the company that I told you about in the first session, they go through and have vast budgets where 10 people are working continuously every day of their working lives to go through and work on these type of things. So if you're a small to medium-sized enterprise, it's really quite daunting to get involved in something like scenario planning. It can also lead to a sense of paralysis. The more you do this, the more you realize that the world is really, really difficult to go through and predict. So what's the point in doing it? Okay? And it takes a very courageous person to go to their boss to say, we expect this inconceivable event to really occur in a few years' time. And to go through and mitigate this, or to exploit that opportunity, please give me 1 million USD. Right? They're trying to go through and convince their chief executive to go on something which is a very unlikely bet. And that's a hard thing to do. Much easier to go to them with something which is predictable. Okay? So these are some of the disadvantages of scenario planning. Right? The number 1 building block of scenario planning is the world is volatile. And the first exercise I've got for you is to go through and to click on the link that you can see on the slide and look at this particular video. It's 2 minutes long, produced by Deloitte. Follow the instructions and highlight in a brief statement about the kind of volatility that Deloitte are talking about.